Our conventional ideas of time and space in neuroscience, which are borrowed from the Newtonian physics, don't fully ever explain how the brain actually generates experience as well as memory. Although place cells and time cells seem to map locations and moments as if they were coordinates, this framework clashes with the fact that the physical time moves uniformly while subjective time varies dramatically. Drawing on modern physics and brain body research, this particular paper proposes a different point of view. It says that time is not a container or a linear dimension, but a relational measure of change. Physical time, in other words, relies on external clocks, but experience time emerges from nested brain body rhythms or waves that operate at different temporal scales, and these rhythms or waves shape memory, perception, and the feeling of time passing for us humans. This rhythm-based structure is not an internal clock, but it might be what gives rise to our subjective experience of time as humans. So let's talk about this paper. For decades, neuroscience has attempted to map the human mind using concepts inherited from classical physics. In this traditional framework, space is treated as a stable backdrop and time as a straight line moving forward in uniform steps. These assumptions have guided how researchers interpret brain activities, especially in the field related to memory as well as navigation. The discovery of place cells and time cells strengthen the idea that the brain builds internal coordinates of where we are and when we are, or when the events occur. And so this continuously create maps on which memories are anchored within the brain of, in this case, humans. And though intuitively this notion is appealing, they have never fully explained the most striking feature of the human experience, which is the time of clocks never appear to match the time of the human consciousness. Now, this paper proposes that the problem lies in the framework itself. The tension between physical time and the experience time within humans reveal a deeper mismatch to some extent. Physics has already moved on beyond the classical picture, yet neuroscience appears to continue to rely on it, aka the classical physics. Modern physics, on the other hand, no longer treat space as a passive container or time as a universal flow. Instead, they view both as relational properties emerging from interactions. This paper then suggests that neuroscience should make a similar conceptual shift, in that rather than pitching the brain as a representing fixed coordinate of space and time, we should, on the other hand, understand time as something that is constructed through change and is organized through the rhythms or waves of the brain as well as the body. Now, this shift begins with a simple observation. There is no dedicated clock inside the human brain that runs like a machine, for example. Physical time requires an external device that divides reality into equal units as we know it. The brain works, however, very differently. It generates patterns in terms of waves and oscillations. It coordinates activity across neurons, across circuit and the bodily systems. with the help of these oscillations or waves. These oscillations occur at many scales, from rapid millisecond level rhythms involved in perception to slower cycles linked to breathing, for example, or heartbeats or hormonal fluctuations for that matter. Now, this paper describes the experience time as a product of this hierarchical rhythm structure or wave-like structure, where each wave provides a reference frame for detecting change. Together, they appear to create a nested set of temporal anchors that the brain uses to interpret events and generate memories as a result. Now, if we shift our perspective and look at the brain and body of humans from this perspective, we realize that time cells and place cells can be understood without assuming that the brain encodes a literal timeline in the brain. These cells may reflect the regularities and transitions generated by rhythmic activity rather than fixed coordinates. A memory, for example, becomes a pattern of relationship among events that are bound together through the rhythms or waves active at the time of the encoding of the brain within of the encoding of the event within the brain. When those rhythms shift because of emotional states, for example, or attention or states and whatnot, the subjective experience of time shifts as well. This accounts for one of the most consistent features of the human life, in that time feels fast when we are absorbed and slow when we are waiting. If you've noticed that already in your life, the same external duration can be experienced as compressed or expanded depending on the internal rhythmic landscape of the individual. Now, this proposal has important implication for how we understand episodic memory, for example. Memories are not stamped into a timeline, but woven into a network of changes. For example, a memory of a conversation that you've had may be linked to not only what was said, but also to the breathing patterns, heart rhythms, cortical oscillations present at that moment, and so forth. As the body and the brain transition through different states, events become ordered relative to those changing internal conditions. This offers a more biological, grounded explanation as to why memories are so strongly tied to context. When a rhythm or a wave is reactivated at a later point in time, the associated memory can be reconstructed. The flow of time, we feel, therefore, is not an inherent property of the world, but a reflection of how these waves guide our interpretation of the change itself. This paper also touches upon the conceptual shift that might be required for us to align neuroscience with the modern physics. Physics no longer, for example, frames time as a universal backdrop, but as a measure that emerges from interactions among physical systems. This paper then applies a similar idea to the brain itself, that time is created by relationships, not by representations. It is not an internal clock by a dynamic measure per se of a change generated continuously through rhythmic processes. By extension, the subjective timeline of experience is fluid, therefore, because the rhythms or these oscillations themselves are fluid by definition, they are waves. They accelerate, decelerate, and synchronize in response to internal as well as the external events that we experience. This proposed perspective leads to a much more flexible understanding of how the brain constructs reality. Instead of viewing time and space as pre-existing structure that the brain maps onto, they become consequences of the brain's attempt to organize change. Space can also be reconsidered through this lens. Place cells may not encode an objective coordinated system, for example, but instead reflect stable patterns of transitions across sensory and motor systems within the brain. Just as the sense of time arises from rhythmic flows, the sense of space arises from relational patterns among movements, sensory changes, and internal states of the individual. And in this framework, both time and space emerge from the same underlying principle that they are ways describing change against a backdrop of rhythmic or wave-like organization within the body as well as the brain of the individual. These implications extend to several domains within the neuroscience discipline. For example, studies of memory, perception, and consciousness often rely on the assumption that the brain stores information relative to an internal timeline. If this timeline does not exist in the way that it was previously assumed, research may shift toward understanding how waves coordinate to create the structure of the experience within a human individual, for example. In clinical fields, on the other hand, they also may find value in this view, in that disorders that affect perception of time, such as anxiety, depression, they often involve disruption in the brain and the body waves and rhythms. And a rhythm-based framework, in this sense, might offer a more direct explanation for these distortions, for example. It's important to note that this particular paper does not explain the full empirical evidence supporting this view, but it lays out a conceptual foundation. It invites neuroscientists, for example, to rethink their core assumption as to how we adopt a model in which time is not an internal representation only, but an attempt to be an emergent property of rhythmic change, oscillations of change within the body and the brain. Memory then becomes a reconstruction of relationships rather than the replay of a stored coordinate of information within the brain, for example. Subjective time becomes a reflection of the dynamic coupling between the brain and the body by aligning neuroscience with modern physics and biological rhythms or waves. This paper reframes one of the most fundamental questions in the study of the mind, as an example, in that what we experience as time may be nothing more than an organized pattern of change that keeps the brain and the body in motion. Now, the question is, how might these modern neuroscience perspective, or at least proposed one, be affecting the symbiotic intelligence, in that it might be a powerful bridge to this principle in terms of modern neuroscience and symbiotic intelligence, in that if we experience time emerging from the rhythmic or oscillation interplane of the brain and the body rather than a fixed internal clock, in that case, then any system seeking to work alongside humans must understand these rhythms, these waves, these oscillations, rather than relying on rigid timeline the way in which we function today. In that case, symbiotic intelligence is built on the idea that machines should adapt to the human internal state instead of forcing humans to adapt to the mechanical protocols that are existing today. A rhythm or a wave of electrical signals, for example, that where a model is based upon of time, it strengthens this argument in actuality because the brain then constructs the feeling of time by referencing oscillations or its brain waves across levels of the nervous system, where the key to the true human machine cooperation might lie in that they sense and they interpret those rhythms, those brainwaves rhythms, or any other rhythms for that matter, that lies within the human body and the human systems, or the biological systems for that matter. And so in a world, or in a future world, where humanoids and intelligent systems respond to human in real time, as is proposed by symbiotic intelligence, the goal is not to mimic the human cognition per se, but to synchronize with human patterns as well as learn from these human patterns. This includes perception of change, attention shifts, emotional states, and the dynamic ways in which humans experience the present moment and their memories. If subjective time stretches and contracts depending on internal rhythms, then machines that rely solely on physical time will always be slightly out of sync with the humans that they serve or they connect to or they cooperate with. In this manner, symbiotic intelligence solves this by grounding interactions in biosignals driven reference framework work. Heart rate, for example, breathing cycles, EEG, aka brainwaves, as an examples, could be the physiological rhythms that become a point of alignment with these future humanoids and machines. In other words, for a machine to operate within the human sense of time, it must then be able to interpret the same rhythms that give rise to that sense and then sensory system and the biological system that exists today within the human body and the human brain. And so this connection reframes the future of artificial systems, I should say, from external tools to internal partners. They lean not just what humans do, but how humans experience and how their experiences unfold in time. When a system, for example, can read and respond to the rhythms or the waves that structure memory and is subjective in time, the relationships become actually much more fluid. For example, an AI system or a humanoid system that detects the slowing of cognitive rhythms within the human brain due to fatigue, for example, can adapt its behavior, pacing its communication to match the user's internal tempo, as an example, and as depicted by symbiotic intelligence. Instead of running on a fixed timeline, it becomes attuned to the user's lived rhythm as it's depicted by symbiotic intelligence. And this is the core of symbiotic intelligence, in that it's not about replacing the human capabilities, but about creating a shared temporal structure in which both humans and machine operate and enhance one another. In future or next generation humanoids, for example, if memories and experiences are encoded relative to changing the internal rhythms within the biological system, then the system that want to understand the human behavior must integrate rhythmically to the rhythmical data as part of their model of the human body and the human brain. A humanoid, as an example, that can read multi-scale biosignals is closer to reading the user's internal timeline. This gives it the ability to predict cognitive load, emotional drift, or readiness for engagement of the user. For example, in effect, the machine becomes sensitive to the same variables that shape the human experience and the human internal timeline. And this sensitivity is what makes the interaction feel much more natural rather than just a mechanical interaction and cooperation. This proposed reframing of the internal timeline within biological systems, as proposed by this paper, is a relational measure of change that is a natural philosophical foundation of symbiotic intelligence, if you will. For example, this work of symbiotic intelligence already positions biosignals as a gateway into the internal world of biological systems, in this case, the human's biological systems. And the argument within this paper actually strengthens the idea that the mind's structure is rhythmic and it's relational rather than linear and clock based as we have known it until today. This makes symbiotic intelligence not just a technological vision, but a biological grounded one. The future of human machine interaction and integration depends on systems that can enter the rhythmic space, where human experience is created in rhythms, in oscillations, and the electrical wave like framework within our biological systems. And by building the rhythm rather than against them, symbiotic intelligence aligns itself with the fundamental way that the brain and the body construct time, space, memory, as well as meaning. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you like the research paper that we covered today. Also, I hope that you like the way in which we covered the more cutting edge neuroscience as well as biological research to cutting edge humanoids and next generation humanoids, as in symbiotic intelligence. As always, I will link the paper below. I will also link the book below for your reference. Let me know what you think, and thanks for all your likes, shares, and comments. See you next time. Bye.